Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to be on the panel and to listen to the wisdom that Landon and Tony imparted. I am a reformed lawyer of sorts. I was a practicing lawyer for 20 years before I came to Exelon Corporation. I started at Exelon as a lawyer, became the general counsel, and now have a position where the general counsel reports to me, but I do very little law, and I do primarily other things, strategy and financial. And I've recently inherited for our company the world that Tony has done for the last 20 years. So I am a little naive relative to Tony, I think, in this world, and probably have a mix of emotions and thoughts on this that are not fully mature. But one thing that struck me in listening to Hugh and your story, Hugh, is really a remarkable story, a story of personal resilience and passion that I think we can all derive, whatever our politics are, some inspiration from, is that as you described the story, and I went back and read a fair amount about the case, and as you described the story, I would submit that the fact situation that you talked about is a fairly easy one, or should be a fairly easy one, in which to come down on one side or another. The facts are so extreme. And yet, 4 Supreme Court justices, the same 4 who comprise the bulk of the majority in the Citizens United case, felt differently about it. And it's really remarkable to me that that's a 5-4 decision where that kind of influence is exerted, and it is so evident what had happened. The world, I think that Tony and now I more recently operate in, is a much, much more subtle world than the one that is confronted in the case of a judicial election where someone is going to hold, in a case that is specific to your company, is going to hold your fate in his or her hands. And in the world in which we operate, for the most part, we don't make any political contributions to judges, to my knowledge, and I've gone back and looked at our disclosure statements, but we do make contributions to elected officials. It is a more complex set of issues. These are folks who typically do not have an issue that is Exelon specific, but has broader policy considerations. There are a lot of constituents on various sides. It's not one side win and one side lose, and it has implications well beyond the company, almost everything that is before the government that is of interest to us. And I think in that more subtle world, there is a fairly compelling case to be made for the fact that everyone should have access to the policymakers to be able to tell their stories to them. And that's what Tony does, that's what we do. And the stark reality is that in order to get the access to tell the story, it is oftentimes necessary to make political contributions in order to have the ability to talk to people or to have a forum where you can do that. And I don't think that there is conceptually anything objectionable about that at all, as objectionable as I find what happened to you, Hugh. The interesting policy thing for all of us to consider is, how do we bridge the gap between those two worlds, the extreme world that is issue specific, where there is so much that seems basically evil in what happened to you, and a world of legitimate desire to be able to have discourse with elected or officials about matters of public policy. And unless you take the extreme position and say you shouldn't have that, or you shouldn't be able to make political contributions, then you have a large place in between those two worlds where you have to think of what are the rules that strike the right balance between allowing access and having impartial decision-making done, and on the one hand, and avoiding the abuses that your case that manifested themselves in your case, Hugh. And in that regard, I don't have an answer. There's no recipe for that. But I do want to say just a little bit in response, Landon, to what you talked about, is that in the middle world there, transparency is really, really important. It is a medium that allows us at least to get a grasp on excesses and where excesses have occurred. It may not be the policy-driven thing that gets us to impartiality in all circumstances, but it does allow identification of excesses, which is something that we're all, I think, vitally concerned with. And I'll tell you, just as an illustration, what we do and how it's fairly hard under the way we conduct our business. It would be fairly hard for us to engage in the kinds of excesses that Hugh talked about. We have contribution guidelines for the company. We post those guidelines on our website. They're publicly available. We make semi-annual disclosure reports, and in those disclosure reports, we report all corporate contributions to candidates, political committees, or parties, every contribution, no matter the size. We report all the contributions we make to company PACs. We have four company PACs, political action committees. We report expenditures in support of or opposing candidates. So if we hold an event and we spend in some way. We report payments to trade associations in excess of $50,000, and then we ask the trade associations to tell us what portion of what we've spent goes towards political advocacy, and then we report that information. We report expenditures to influence ballot measures, something that would be candidate neutral but nonetheless have policy implications. And finally, we report spending on direct issue advertising that relates to business and financial issues that don't support or oppose a candidate directly. So we try to lay out all of those things that allow people to look and say, what is Exelon doing and how is that impacting what advocacy they're doing in terms of the spending of money. We gathered this from the Model Code for Corporate Political Spending that is generated by the Center for Political Accountability. And we also, by the way, have a series of delegation of authority rules about who can do political expenditures. So an expenditure above a very modest level has to be approved by our CEO and above another level by our board of directors. So we try to have some internal checks and balances on what we do as well. What I find interesting about this is that the reason that we are trying to advocate, ultimately the reason we're trying to advocate and have access to advocate positions is for the benefit of our shareholders. Those are the people who we have a fiduciary duty to represent and to advocate on their behalf. This whole phenomena of transparency is being driven by shareholders. Those are the people, by and large. There are not rules anywhere that require us to do the things that I just identified. But we had shareholder proposals that said, we want this disclosure. We want to know what you're going to do and how you're spending your money politically. And I think that says something ultimately that's fairly good about the country. So as we look at Hugh's situation and we say there is so much infection, I do think that there, and Sarbanes-Oxley reflects this as well, there is a sense that there ought to be a basic fairness and transparency ought to be a part of it. And in 2011, there were a large number of shareholder proposals requiring reporting, asking for reporting for companies that have big advocacy budgets, Conoco, Walmart, Wells Fargo, Boeing, Ford, Citigroup, to name a few. And 2 weeks ago, the Securities and Exchange Commission ruled that companies must allow proposals that seek review and advisory vote on corporate political expenditures, which is a breakthrough in terms of what the corporate obligations will be. So I guess in conclusion, what I would say is it is easy when we hear of circumstances like the circumstance that Hugh described and the really pain and agony that he's lived through, to say we should take an extreme position. We should do what we can do to be resolute and ensure that none of this can happen, and we should ensure that none of that can happen. But we need to, in my view, as a basic balancing piece, look and see what can we do through transparency, through regulation, and otherwise to, while we address those situations, also allow companies to have the basic discourse with elected officials that I think ultimately, if it's done correctly, balances and promotes public policy.